Deep space doesn't echo. It hums. An empty, indifferent static that grinds against the whole of deep space haulers until the crew stop hearing it. But on a random Tuesday Standard Earth time, that dead static broke. A mathematical scream ripped through the void encoded in a frequency no human tech was supposed to catch. It wasn't a greeting. It was a dying gasp meant for a civilization of gods. Humanity intercepted it instead. The Orizaba was a ship that smelled perpetually of burnt ozone and stale coffee. She was a heavy salvage and repair rig officially designated to the outer Perseus arm, which was corporate speak for being a garbage truck in the middle of nowhere. She creaked when she thrust. She groaned when she braked. And right now, drifting in the dead calm of a mining sector that had been tapped out a century ago, she was blissfully quiet. Captain David Miller stared at the primary viewport, nursing a cracked ceramic mug. The synthetic brew inside tasted like battery acid and regret, but it kept the blood pumping behind his tired eyes. He was 45, but the low-gravity hauling and the radiation scarring made him look 10 years older. He watched the dust motes drift across the slow-spinning debris of a dead asteroid. Routine. Quiet. Safe. Safe. "I'm getting a ghost in the machine," Sarah said. Her voice broke the silence of the bridge, tight and irritated. Sarah Jenkins, the ship's communications officer, lived in a tangled nest of wires, headsets, and half-dismantled receiver modules. She was 28, fueled entirely by nicotine patches and a stubborn refusal to let any anomaly go unlogged. "Define ghost," David replied, not turning away from the viewport. "If it's another solar flare bouncing off the relay, I'm logging it as background radiation. It's not a flare." Sarah's fingers flew across the analog switches of her console. "It's a structured pulse, narrow band, but the frequency is wrong. It's way out of our operational spectrum." David finally turned. He set his mug down on the navigation console, a ring of brown liquid staining the metal. "How far out?" "It's broadcasting on a quantum resonance band. We shouldn't even be able to pick it up. The only reason we caught it is because Thomas jury-rigged the primary dish. Bypass last week with those scrap superconductor coils, and we're catching the spillover. The signal is bleeding down into standard radio waves." Sarah yanked her headset off and slammed it onto the desk. "And it's loud." "It's deafeningly loud. Put it on the speakers." Sarah hesitated. "Captain, it's compressed. A lot of data in a very small window. It might sound—" "Put it on, Jenkins." She flipped a switch. The sound that filled the bridge wasn't static. It wasn't the rhythmic ping of a distress beacon or the chaotic white noise of a dying star. It was a dense, overlapping harmony, a choir of mechanical grinding, high-pitched shrieks, and a low rhythmic thrumming that rattled the metal grating beneath David's boots. It sounded like a cathedral collapsing in on itself played at triple speed. It made David's teeth ache. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up an ancient primate instinct, warning him of a predator in the dark. "Cut it," he ordered. Sarah killed the audio. The silence that followed was heavy ringing in their ears. "What the hell was that?" A voice grunted from the aft corridor. Thomas Hayes stepped onto the bridge, wiping black grease from his hands with an already filthy rag. The chief engineer was built like a cinder block sporting a scruffy beard and a perpetual scowl. Felt that vibration all the way down in the engine room. Did we throw a grav plating coil? No, David said softly. Sarah caught something on the comms. Thomas walked over to Sarah's station, leaning over her shoulder to look at the oscillating waveforms frozen on her monitor. He squinted. That's not human, no kidding, Sarah muttered. The encryption is recursive. It's a fractal algorithm. Every time I try to crack the surface layer, it unfolds into a dozen more complex layers. Whoever sent their tech makes our quantum drives look like stone tools. David crossed his arms. So why are they broadcasting? And to who? That's the weird part, Sarah said, her fingers dancing across the keys again. It's not an omnidirectional broadcast. It's a tight beam laser transmission. A straight line. We just happened to drift right through the beam's path. It's aimed at the galactic core, specifically the old coordinates of the Tantalus cluster. David felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The Tantalus cluster was a dead zone, a region of space packed with shattered, hollowed-out planets. The corporate academies taught that a civilization existed there once billions of years ago. The academic types called them the custodians. They were a myth, a ghost story archaeologists told each other over drinks. Run a translation sequence. David said, use the deep learning lattice. Strip the audio and look for a structural syntax. Captain, if this is a fractal code from a Tier 1 civilization, the ship's computer is going to melt trying to translate it. Route auxiliary power from life support if you have to. David ordered, his voice brooking no argument. I want to know what they are saying. Thomas leaned against the bulkhead, tossing his dirty rag onto a chair. You know, standard corporate protocol says we log anomalous alien transmissions and jump to the nearest checkpoint. We aren't explorers, Dave. We fix broken fusion reactors for a living. I know what we do, Tom. David stared at the waveform on the screen. But someone out there is screaming. I want to know why. For 3 hours the Orizaba drifted. The ship's internal temperature dropped by 10 as power was shunted to the central processing core. Sarah sat frozen at her station, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the progress bar crawl. Finally the console chimed. A soft, clear ping. I have a partial, Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. I broke the visual and audio envelope. It's a repeating loop. Put it on the main screen. David said. The viewport darkened, replaced by a holographic projection. The image flickered, distorted by the downgrade from quantum data to standard human optical tech, but it was clear enough. It was a face, or something like it. It was tall, angular, encased in what looked like biological armor, a carapace of iridescent silver and deep black. It had 4 eyes, narrow and glowing with a faint blue light, but right now that light was flickering. One side of the entity's face was badly scorched, weeping a luminescent violet fluid. Behind the entity, the background was a nightmare. A massive metallic structure was tearing itself apart. Arcs of raw plasma slashed across the frame, and the sky behind the structure was bleeding a sickly infected green. The entity spoke. The ship's translation matrix overlaid the alien gutturals with a flat, synthesized human voice. Containment has failed. The world engine is fracturing. The rot has consumed the outer rings. To the custodians of the core, if you still listen, we beg of you, Our children burn. The containment fields will hold for exactly 3 local cycles. Send the fleet. Send the light. We are dying. To the custodians, we are dying. The message looped. The desperate burning face returned to the beginning of its plea. Sarah cut the feed. No one spoke. The hum of the Orizaba suddenly felt very small, very fragile. They're calling the custodians. Thomas said, his voice stripped of its usual gruff sarcasm. He stared at the blank screen. They're calling a myth. Not a myth to them, Sarah said. Her hands were shaking slightly. She clasped them in her lap. Captain, they're sending a tight beam to a graveyard. The custodians have been dead for 2 billion years. Nobody is coming for them. David paced the length of the bridge. The cynical, practical part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive in the void for 20 years, was screaming at him. Erase the logs. Power up the drive. Go home. This was not a broken pipeline on a mining colony. This was a Tier 1 civilization, a species that likely built stars for fun, begging for a mythical savior because their world engine was failing. The rot, whatever that was, it was tearing a hyper-advanced mega-structure apart. What are coordinates of the signal's origin? David asked. Sarah swallowed hard. I tracked the trajectory backward. It's coming from the Carina Sagittarius arm, an uncharted sector, about 80 light-years from our current position. 80 light-years, Thomas scoffed. He pushed himself off the bulkhead. Dave, don't even think about it. You saw that footage. You saw the scale of whatever was blowing up behind that poor bastard. That wasn't a ship. That was a continent-sized machine. I know. We are a repair rig, a heavy hauler. We have a crew of 3, a cargo bay full of arc welders, dursteel plating, and a couple of outdated plasma torches. We don't have weapons. We don't have shields. We are ants, Dave. We don't belong in a fight between gods. David stopped pacing. He looked at Thomas. They aren't fighting. They're breaking. It's the same thing. Thomas dragged a hand down his face. You heard it. Containment failed. The rot, whatever that is, it's going to wipe them out. If we jump there, we're just throwing ourselves into the incinerator. They have 3 cycles. Sarah interjected quietly. She looked up at David, her eyes wide, reflecting the dim emergency lighting of the bridge. Captain, 3 of their cycles roughly translates to 72 human hours. After that, their containment drops. And then what? Thomas asked. And then they all burn. Sarah looked down at her console. The data packet. It wasn't just a video. There was a telemetry attachment. I didn't want to run it because I thought it would crash the system, but I can see the raw numbers. Population metrics. David braced himself. Population metrics. David braced himself. How many? 14 billion. Sarah choked on the number. 14 billion lives on that structure. Mostly civilian. They are trapped behind a failing energy shield, waiting for a fleet of saviors that died before the earth even had oceans. The silence returned heavier this time. 14 billion. It was a number so large it lost its meaning, becoming an abstract weight that pressed down on David's chest. We walk away, Thomas said, though his voice lacked its previous fire. We have to. We send the data to Earth Command. Let the military handle it. Earth Command is 6 weeks away by courier drone, David said flatly. By the time the brass even looks at the file, those people will be ash. So we die with them. Thomas stepped closer to David. Is that the plan? A grand, noble suicide? We jump 80 light years to stand in front of a broken world engine and do what? Dave patch a failing continental shield with some duct tape and a welding torch. It's an engine, Tom. David locked eyes with his engineer. Thomas blinked. What? You heard the translation. World engine containment fields. David pointed a finger at Thomas's chest. You're the best damn mechanic in the Perseus arm. You've kept this flying trash can running for a decade past her expiration date. I've seen you cold restart a fusion core with a bypassed ignition switch and a prayer. An engine is an engine. It's alien technology. Thomas yelled, his frustration boiling over. It operates on physics we haven't even theorized yet. Thermodynamics is thermodynamics. David countered, his voice hard, authoritative. Energy flows from high to low. Pressure builds. Pressure needs a release. They are begging for help. They are asking for custodians. Well, the custodians are dead. David turned to look at the main screen at the phantom image of the burning alien. The universe doesn't care about fair, David said quietly. It doesn't care about scales of power. It just threw a distress signal at the only ship stupid enough to be drifting out here. The gods are dead, but the mechanics are in. Sarah let out a shaky breath, a small, terrified smile touching the corners of her mouth. She immediately began typing. Calculating jump vectors. 80 light years is going to push the Alcubierre drive past the red line. It's going to be a rough transit, Captain. Thomas stared at David for a long, agonizing moment. He looked at the grease on his hands, then up at the ceiling of the battered ship. He let out a long, defeated sigh. I'm going to need all the auxiliary power rooted to the structural integrity field. Thomas grumbled, turning toward the door. If we're jumping 80 light years in one go, the hull is going to scream. And David looked over. Yeah, if we get there, and I can't fix it, if we die because you wanted to play hero, Thomas pointed a grease-stained finger at him. I'm haunting you forever. Noted, David said. Get to the engine room, Chief. Spool up the drive. The Orisaba was not built for deep, single-burst jumps. Her Alcubierre drive was designed for short hops between local star systems carefully plotted along established corporate space lanes. Jumping 80 light years into uncharted territory without a navigational beacon was the equivalent of driving a rusted pickup truck off a cliff in the dark and hoping you hit a ramp. In the engine room, Thomas worked like a demon. He bypassed the safety regulators, physically ripping out the governor chips with a pair of pliers. He rerouted the coolant lines, flooding the drive core with liquid nitrogen to keep the exotic matter from boiling over before they even launched. The ship rumbled around him, a low, unhappy vibration that spoke of metal being pushed to its absolute breaking point. On the bridge, David strapped himself into the command chair. The harness dug into his shoulders. Coordinates locked, Sarah said. Her voice was strained against the mounting G-force as the ship's artificial gravity struggled to compensate for the spooling warp bubble. Captain, the translation software is picking up background chatter from the destination coordinates. It's a mess. Millions of automated distress pings, automated evacuation protocols, and screaming. "Mute the audio," David ordered. "We need clear heads. Tom, give me a status." "The drive is eating itself." Thomas's voice cracked over the comms. "I've got the containment field at 110%. We're going to lose a lot of ablative armor on the transit. We punch it now or the core goes critical and we evaporate right here." "Hold on something," David said. He reached forward and slammed his hand down on the primary ignition lever. The universe tore open. Normal space didn't just fade, it shattered. The Orizaba violently wrenched herself out of local reality and plummeted into the subspace corridor. The inertial dampeners failed instantly. David was slammed back into his seat with the force of a falling building. The air in his lungs vanished. The ship screamed. It was a literal sound, the agonizing screech of titanium hull plates, warping under impossible gravitational shear. The bulkheads groaned, the lighting flickered, and a shower of sparks erupted from Sarah's console. Outside the viewport, there were no stars, just a terrifying blinding tunnel of violet and black radiation. David gritted his teeth, tasting blood where he had bitten his own cheek. He forced his eyes to stay open, watching the chronometer on the dash. The transit would take 4 minutes. It felt like 4 lifetimes. "Hull integrity down to 80%. Sarah yelled over the roar of the ship, her hands gripping the edges of her console, white-knuckled. "We're shedding mass." "Hold together, you old piece of junk," David hissed through his teeth. At 3 minutes, the primary coolant line blew. A klaxon blared on the bridge, painting them in flashing red light. Thomas's voice came over the comms, breathless and panicked. "I'm losing the magnetic bottle. We're coming in too hot, Dave. I have to drop us out of warp now." "Do it," David yelled. Reality snapped back like a rubber band. The Orizaba violently decanted into real space, spinning wildly out of control. The artificial gravity failed completely, sending loose tools, coffee mugs, and debris floating into the air before slamming them down again as the emergency thrusters fired, auto-correcting their pitch and yaw. David gasped for breath, his chest heaving against the harness. He'd blinked away the black spots in his vision. The klaxons were still blaring. The smell of burning rubber and melted copper filled the bridge. "Status?" David coughed. "Drive is offline." Thomas panted over the comms. "Core is stable, but we blew 3 relays. Give me 10 minutes to patch it." "Sarah? Where are we?" Sarah didn't answer. David turned to look at her. She was staring out the primary viewport. Her mouth slightly open, the glow of the scene outside washing over her face in hues of sickly green and violent orange. David unbuckled his harness and stood up, stepping up to the glass. His breath caught in his throat. Thomas had been right. They were ants. Before then lay a Dyson Sphere, or at least the remains of one. It was a mega-structure so impossibly massive that it dwarfed the gas giants David had seen in the Sol system. A colossal cage of interlocking metallic rings, continents of metal woven around a captive raging white dwarf star. But the cage was broken. Vast sections of the sphere were shattered, pulverized into fields of debris the size of small moons. Out snorts of these wounds, the captive star was bleeding, lashing out with tendrils of raw stellar plasma that whipped against the surviving structure. And then there was the rot. David saw what the alien had meant. Creeping across the pristine silver metal of the intact rings was a biological nightmare, a sprawling fractal growth of pulsating sickly green matter. It looked like a fungal infection, but it was eating the metal, dissolving the very architecture of the megastructure. At the center of the largest intact ring, an energy shield shimmered, a fragile dome of blue light holding back the vacuum, the plasma, and the creeping green rot. Inside that dome, David could just barely make out the geometric shapes of a city that covered a surface area larger than Earth. 14 billion lives trapped behind a dome that was visibly flickering. "Captain," Sarah whispered. Her console beeped softly. "I'm picking up localized comms. The shield generator is failing. The localized energy grid is completely disorganized. They don't know how to route the power from the star to the shield without the primary conduits." David stared at the apocalypse in front of him. The sheer scale of the engineering was beyond human comprehension. The math involved in holding a star captive, the materials required to build continents of metal. They were gods, but gods could bleed. Gods panic. And they clearly didn't know how to run a bypass. Tom David keyed the comms. His voice was terrifyingly calm. "Yeah, Dave." Thomas sounded exhausted. "Get your tools." David said, his eyes locked on the failing blue dome. "We've got an engine to fix." The Orisaba crept toward the dying megastructure like a gnat approaching a hurricane. Proximity alarms screamed continuously. The ship's rudimentary sensors were entirely overwhelmed by the sheer output of the fractured white dwarf star. Radiation shielding degraded by the minute. Thomas had locked the blast shutters over the secondary windows, leaving only the primary viewport and the tactical sensors to guide them in. "I can't hail them," Sarah said. Her hands flew across her terminal, fighting through layers of static that sounded like grinding metal. "Their localized comms are a mess. It's an automated panic cascade. Millions of overlapping distress signals. They aren't looking out. They're entirely focused inward." David gripped the thruster controls. His knuckles were white. Find a breach in the outer ring. Something close to that failing shield dome. Something close to that failing shield dome. If we can't talk to them, we knock on the front door. Steering the hauler through the debris field was an exercise in terrifying precision. Fragments of the shattered Dyson Sphere drifted past them, some the size of mountains. The metal was alien, a smooth, seamless alloy that caught the harsh, violent light of the captive star. There, Sarah pointed to a tactical redoubt Aventine quadrant, or whatever their equivalent is. The shield dome originates from a central pylon, but the primary power conduit leading to it is severed. It looks like a docking bay or an access trench right beneath the fracture. "I see it." David pitched the ship down. They dove into the trench. The scale of the architecture defied reason. The trench was wide enough to swallow a fleet of human dreadnoughts. Smooth walls of iridescent silver blurred past them. Below, vast rivers of luminescent fluid, coolant, or maybe data, were visibly bleeding out into the vacuum, freezing into crystallized clouds. "Atmosphere detected," Sarah called out, checking her monitors. "The trench still has a localized gravity well and a breathable mix. They're venting oxygen like crazy, but it's holding for now." "Bringing us down," David said. He flared the thrusters. The Orisaba shuddered, fighting the sudden pull of the artificial gravity. The landing gear deployed with a heavy metallic plunk. They hit the deck hard. Sparks showered from the port side skidded as the ship slid, 50 yards before grinding to a halt against a raised structural ridge. Silence descended on the bridge, broken only by the hum of the auxiliary generator. "We're down," David breathed, wiping a cold sweat from his forehead. Thomas stepped onto the bridge, already wearing the lower half of his EVA suit. He carried a heavy-duty plasma cutter in one hand and a coiled length of diagnostic fiber optics over his shoulder. He looked out the viewport. The hangar was cavernous. Towering pillars of light pulsed weakly, and gathering at the base of the Orizaba were the locals. There were perhaps a dozen of them. They matched the entity from the distress transmission. Tall, spindly, encased in biomechanical armor that looked grown rather than forged. They held long, staff-like instruments that hummed with latent energy. Weapons or tools, David couldn't tell. "They don't look happy," Thomas observed. "They're terrified," Sarah corrected softly. "Look at their posture. They're defensive. They probably think we're a symptom of the rot. Time to say hello." David unbuckled his harness. Sarah linked the translation matrix to the exterior loudspeakers. "Tom, you're with me. Bring the big tool kit, the heavy one." The airlock cycled with a hiss of equalizing pressure. The ramp lowered heavily, hitting the pristine mirror-like deck of the hangar with a resounding clang that made several of the alien figures flinch. David walked down the ramp, Thomas a half step behind him. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't make any sudden moves. He just walked with the heavy, measured tread of a man who had a job to do. The lead alien stepped forward. Up close they were even taller, nearly 8 feet. 4 narrow eyes glowing with a dim, desperate blue light scrutinized the humans. The alien's carapace was scored with carbon burns. The alien spoke, a rapid clicking sequence of resonant tones. Sarah's voice echoed from the ship's exterior speakers a second later, the computer flattening the desperate emotion into standard English. "You are small. Your vessel is primitive. Where is the fleet of the custodians? Where is the light?" David stopped at the bottom of the ramp. He looked up at the towering being. "The custodians are dead," David said. His voice, amplified by his suit comms, echoed across the vast hangar. "They died a long time ago. We intercepted your signal by accident." The translation matrix fed his words back to the alien. The creature physically recoiled. The blue light in its eyes flickered, dimming. A collective shudder ran through the gathered group. Dead. Then the math is finite. The world engine falls. The rot consumes us. The alien lowered its staff. "Why did you come here, tiny things, to witness the end?" "We came to fix your engine." Thomas grunted, stepping up beside David and dropping his heavy toolbox onto the deck. The solid thud rang out like a gunshot. "Now, where is the broken pipe?" The alien, whose title the translator rendered roughly as archivist, led them through the access corridors. The architecture was beautiful, flowing in organic sweeping curves. There were no sharp angles, no exposed wires, no bolts. Everything was smooth, seamless perfection, which made the damage all the more horrifying. They reached a central command node. Holographic displays floated in midair, shifting and rotating. A dozen other aliens moved frantically between the projections, their forearms a blur of motion, greater than snorts, greater than as they manipulated complex geometric shapes. Through a massive crystalline window, David and Thomas could see the problem. A chasm easily 2 miles wide separated the sector they were in from the central shield pylon. The bridge that once connected them was gone, eaten away by the creeping green fungus of the rot. Across the gap, the blue dome of the shield's generator flickered, starved of power. The primary harmony conduit was severed. The archivist explained, gesturing to a massive severed artery of glowing fluid that jutted out over the chasm. The rot alters the subatomic structure of the metal. It feeds on the energy. We severed the bridge to stop the infection from reaching the shield node, but in doing so, we cut the power. So route it through a secondary system, Thomas said, squinting at the holographic display. Impossible, the archivist said. The quantum fluid requires a perfect resonance lattice to flow. We are attempting to recalculate the harmonics to push a microstream through the maintenance capillaries, but the algorithm will take 6 cycles to balance. The shield will fall in 2. Thomas stared at the alien. He looked at the massive severed pipe bleeding glowing fluid into the void. Then he looked at the receiving node 2 miles away. "You guys don't build bridges, do you?" Thomas asked. "A physical structure without quantum resonance would cause a feedback loop, catastrophic." Yeah, harmonic feedback, catastrophic failure. "I get it." Thomas turned to David. "Dave, they're overthinking it. Explain." David said, "Look at this." Thomas walked straight through the holographic projection, disrupting the delicate geometric shapes. Several alien technicians hissed in protest. Thomas ignored them. He pointed a grease-stained finger at the severed pipe, then drew a straight line in the air to the shield generator. It's fluid dynamics mixed with basic electrical current. They don't need a perfectly balanced quantum stream. They just need raw voltage to keep the shield up. The generator is starving. If we jam a big enough wire between point A and point B, it'll power up. You speak of crude force. The archivist protested the translator, catching a tone of profound offense. To force the fluid through an uncalibrated vessel would tear the conduits apart. It is mathematically barbaric. You're dying, Thomas yelled, rounding on the 8FT alien. Your perfect math is going to get 14 billion people killed. I don't care if it's barbaric. I care if it works. David stepped between them. He looked at Thomas. Can we bridge a 2-mile gap? Not with anything we carry in the toolbox, Thomas admitted. But the Orisaba, she's a heavy salvage tug. We have the primary spool of high-tensile superconductor towing cable. It's insulated rated to drag dead dreadnoughts out of gravity wells. It'll handle the heat. The cable is 3 miles long, David noted. Exactly, Thomas grinned, a fierce, feral thing. We take the ship out. We anchor one end of the tow cable directly into that bleeding pipe. We fly across the gap, unspooling the cable, and we ram the other end into the shield node. We make a giant extension cord. David did the mental math. It was stupid. It was suicidal. It relied on brute-forcing alien technology that practically ran on magic. We do it, David said. He turned to the archivist. Listen to me. We are going to build a physical bypass. When we connect the cable, you're going to open the floodgates on this side and push everything you have through it. The feedback will shred the terminal nodes. Then bypass the nodes, David barked. Rip out the safeties, strip the governors, send the raw power straight to the shield. The alien stared at him. The concept of intentionally breaking their own perfect machinery to save it seemed completely alien to them. They were artists, philosophers, mathematicians. They weren't mechanics. We do not know how to rip out the safeties, the archivist admitted, the translation sounding small and defeated. Thomas sighed loudly. He cracked his knuckles. Give me a plasma torch and point me to the main breaker. Thomas said, I'm going to show you boys how to void a warranty. The Orisaba backed out of the hangar trench, her thrusters burning a harsh chemical blue against the elegant, dying light of the alien megastructure. Inside the central node, Thomas was surrounded by frantic aliens. He was currently shoulder-deep in a crystalline access panel, using a heavy steel pry bar to physically snap the delicate harmonic tuning forks that regulated the power flow. Every time one shattered, the aliens flinched. Sarah, Thomas grunted into his combs. I've bypassed the regulators on this end. The pipe is raw. Whenever Dave hooks up, it's going to be a fire hose. Copy that, Chief. Sarah's voice came back tight with stress. Captain is in position. Outside, the Orisaba hovered near the severed artery. The glowing quantum fluid bled into the vacuum, vaporizing into a brilliant mist. David was in the airlock. The outer door slid open. The outer door slid open. The sheer terrifying scale of the Dyson Sphere swallowed his vision. Below him was a drop into the localized atmosphere, and beyond that, the raging surface of the captive star. The heat radiating through his Eva suit was intense, like standing too close to an open furnace. Hanging from the belly of the ship was the magnetic grapple attached to the thick, braided steel of the superconductor tow cable. Lower me down, David commanded. The winch groaned. David, tethered to the ship, was lowered toward the massive severed pipe. The wind of violent updraft of venting atmosphere and thermal radiation battered him. He swung wildly, fighting to stabilize himself with his suit thrusters. He reached the edge of the severed conduit. The metal was jagged, melted by whatever had cut it. Bring the grapple down, David said. The massive magnetic claw descended from the ship. David grabbed the heavy maneuvering handles on the side of the claw. His muscles strained against the thick material of his suit. He wrestled the heavy grapple into the mouth of the bleeding pipe. Lock it down, David yelled. Above him, Sarah triggered the clamp. The grapple snapped open its heavy durasteel teeth, biting violently into the elegant, seamless alien metal. It wasn't a clean connection. It was a brutal physical anchor. Anchor secure, David yelled, pulling himself back up the tether toward the airlock. Sarah, get us moving. We have a gap to cross. David barely cleared the airlock doors when the Orisaba lurched forward. The ship flew out over the chasm. Behind them, the massive drum of the towing winch screamed as it unspooled the heavy cable. The rot was everywhere. As the ship flew over the 2-mile gap, David could see the creeping green fungus clinging to the debris floating in the void. It reached out with sickly pulsing tendrils drawn to the heat of the ship's engines. It's trying to grab us, Sarah warned, pitching the ship upwards to avoid a massive floating chunk of infected metal. Keep the speed up. Don't let it touch the hull, David ordered, strapping himself back into the command chair. The blue dome of the shield generator loomed ahead. It was massive, a monolithic spire of crystal and metal, but the light emanating from it was weak, stuttering like a dying candle. "We're running out of cable," Sarah shouted over the grind of the winch. 200 yards left. Bring us in hard hover, right over the receptor node." The Orisaba slammed on her retro thrusters. The inertial dampeners screamed in protest. The ship skidded to a halt in midair, hovering precariously over the central spire of the shield generator. "Tom," David barked into the combs, "we're at the receptor. We need to jam this cable into the port, but the receptor is protected by a magnetic field." Inside the command node 2 miles away, Thomas wiped sweat from his eyes. "The archivist says the receptor won't open without the proper harmonic frequency. It's a closed port." David looked out the viewport. The cable hung from the ship, dangling right above the sealed glowing port of the shield spire. "I don't have time to sing it a song," David yelled. "We have 50 yards of cable left, and the rot is climbing the pylon." He could see it. The green fungus was slithering up the base of the shield spire, sensing the weakness in the energy field. "Hold on," Thomas said. His voice dropped an octave, entering that zone of pure, dangerous focus that David knew too well. "Archivist, if I route the primary plasma manifold of the local grid into a feedback loop, what happens?" "The pressure would rupture the local grid. It would cause a localized detonation." "Exactly. A kinetic shock wave." "Thomas Dave, I'm going to blow the grid beneath the receptor port. The explosion will force the magnetic field to drop for exactly 2 seconds before the emergency bulkhead slams shut." "You're going to blow up the shield generator to save it?" David asked. "I'm going to knock on the door real hard," Thomas corrected. "When the port flashes red, you drop the cable. Gravity and momentum will do the rest. Get ready to release the winch." David laid his hand over the emergency release lever. "Ready." 2 miles away, Thomas drove his pry bar directly into the main plasma manifold and wrenched it sideways. A shock wave ripped across the chasm. The central spire of the shield generator violently shuddered. For a split second, the elegant, impenetrable magnetic seal over the port short-circuited. The blue light flashed a harsh, angry crimson. Now, Thomas roared. David pulled the lever. The heavy magnetic grapple, dragging miles of high-tensile steel cable, plummeted like a meteor. It slammed into the open receptor port with bone-jarring force. The heavy steel teeth of the grapple bit deep into the delicate crystalline interior, anchoring itself just as the emergency bulkheads tried to slam shut, clamping down tightly around the thick cable. The connection was ugly. It was a crude, mangled knot of human steel, shoved violently into an alien masterpiece. "We're in," David shouted. "Tom, hit it. Flood the line." In the command node, Thomas grabbed a heavy lever he had jury-rigged from a bent pipe. He looked at the horrified alien technicians. "Let there be light." Thomas grunted and threw the switch. Thomas threw the switch. For 1 agonizing second, nothing happened. The massive jury-rigged lever locked into place with a heavy, mechanical clunk that echoed through the crystal-lined command node. The gathered alien technicians froze, their 4 glowing eyes fixed on the severed conduit. Then the universe screamed. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical pressure that bypassed the eardrums and vibrated directly in the marrow of their bones. The quantum fluid, a river of refined stellar energy meant to flow through frictionless, perfectly tuned harmonic lattice, slammed into the crude human superconductor cable. It didn't flow. It rammed. Through the massive viewport, Thomas watched the 3 me length of high-tensile steel cable whip tight. The dark, industrial-grade insulation protecting the wire instantly vaporized, flashing into a blinding cloud of black ash that was immediately scattered by the vacuum. The bare metal of the cable was exposed. In a fraction of a second, the steel went from dull gray to cherry red to a violent, blinding white. "Holy hell," Thomas whispered, throwing an arm up to shield his eyes from the glare. Inside the Orizaba, the situation was entirely out of control. "Captain," Sarah screamed over the deafening roar of the ship's alarms. Every single warning light on her console was burning solid red. "The winch is fusing. The thermal feedback is traveling up the cable into our hull." David gripped the arms of the command chair. The deck plates beneath his boots were growing hot enough to melt the rubber soles. The Orizaba was still tethered to the circuit, hanging directly over the central pylon like a metallic puppet. The raw, unfiltered voltage of a captive star was pumping through a wire directly attached to their underbelly. "Drop the cable," David ordered. "I can't." Sarah hit the release command again and again. Sparks showered over her lap. The mechanical release is welded shut from the heat. The magnetic locks are fused. Outside, the raw power hit the shield receptor. The alien technology was delicate. It was a masterpiece of subatomic engineering designed to accept a gentle, harmonious stream of energy. Instead, humanity had shoved a fire hose of raw, screaming voltage down its throat. The central spire of the shield generator didn't glow. It erupted. A shock wave of solid, concussive light blasted outward from the pylon. The failing blue dome didn't just solidify. It expanded violently. The energy wave hit the creeping, sickly green vines of the rot. The biological infection didn't just die, it was atomized. Vast, sprawling miles of the fungal growth turned to white ash in a microsecond, sterilized by the sheer, unadulterated fury of the brute force current. But the Orizaba was caught in the backwash. The ship was thrown upward, spinning wildly as the thermal updraft from the superheated cable battered her hull. "We're going to melt," Sarah yelled. The temperature gauge on the bridge reached 120. The air tasted of burning plastic and vaporized copper. "Not today." David unbuckled his harness. He didn't bother trying to walk on the wildly pitching deck. He threw himself across the bridge, grabbing the heavy, red-painted handle mounted beneath the tactical console. It was the emergency scuttle release. It wasn't meant to drop a tow cable. It was meant to blow the entire lower cargo bay door in the event of an uncontainable fire. He ripped the safety wire off. He pulled the handle hard. Deep in the bowels of the ship, 6 heavy explosive bolts detonated simultaneously. The Orizaba shuddered violently as her entire lower winch assembly, along with the fused, glowing white tow cable, was physically blown off the chassis. The severed machinery plummeted toward the shield pylon, clattering uselessly against the now blazing energy dome before vaporizing in the heat. Freed from the anchor, the Orizaba shot upward. Thrusters, David yelled, pulling himself back into his seat. "Get us out of the convection column." Sarah's hands flew over the controls, fighting the sluggish, half-melted steering thrusters. The hauler groaned, bleeding momentum before finally leveling out in the upper atmosphere of the localized gravity well. They drifted safely away from the blinding inferno of the makeshift circuit. Silence slowly returned to the bridge, save for the hiss of ruptured coolant lines and the ragged, heavy breathing of the two humans. David looked out the viewport. The chasm was illuminated by a harsh, angry, flickering light. The delicate blue dome of the shield generator was gone. In its place was a thick, violently bright barrier of roaring white plasma. Roaring white plasma. It crackled and spat, entirely devoid of the elegant mathematical grace the aliens had engineered. It was ugly. It was loud. It was deeply, inherently dangerous. But it held. The rot was gone. The vacuum was pushed back. The city beneath the dome was bathed in the harsh glare of survival. David pressed the comms button. "Tom, you still breathing?" Static crackled. Then a heavy sigh. "Yeah, Dave, I'm breathing." Thomas's voice sounded exhausted. "I think I just broke the most expensive machine in the universe. Did it work?" David asked. He looked down at the command node through the cracked glass of the viewport. The cable connecting the severed pipe to the pylon was a line of blinding stellar heat. "Yeah," Thomas said quietly. "It worked. The loop is closed. The pressure is stabilizing. It's ugly as sin, Dave, but it's holding." It took 3 hours for the thermal radiation in the hangar trench to drop to a level where the Orizaba could safely land again. The ship limped back to the deck, her belly scorched black, her port thruster permanently offline. She hit the ground with a heavy, unceremonious thud. David and Sarah walked down the ramp. They were met by Thomas, who was covered in a thick layer of carbon scoring and carrying his heavy toolkit. He looked like he had spent the last 3 hours wrestling a sun, which wasn't far from the truth. Beside him stood the archivist. The towering alien looked up at the Orizaba, then down at the 3 humans. The blue light in the alien's 4 eyes had stabilized, no longer flickering with the frantic pulse of impending death. But as it surveyed the damage, there was a profound, heavy silence. "You destroyed the harmonic regulators," the archivist said. The translation matrix fed the flat, synthesized voice into the human's earpieces. "You shattered the tuning forks. You severed the automated safety relays. You connected a primitive, uncalibrated metal line to a quantum stream. You're welcome." Thomas grunted, dropping his toolkit onto the deck. The archivist slowly turned its gaze to the engineer. "The shield is functioning at 400% capacity. The efficiency is abhorrent. The energy waste is beyond calculation. It is crude. It is violent. It deafens our sensors. But you're alive." David stepped forward. He met the alien's gaze, craning his neck up to look the towering creature in its 4 glowing eyes. "Your people are safe. The rot is dead. You have time to build a real bridge now. Time you didn't have 3 hours ago." The archivist was quiet. It looked out over the vast hangar toward the distant, blinding line of the hot-wired cable. "We called for the custodians," the alien said softly. "We calculated the probability of our survival, and the math dictated that only a civilization of equal or greater Advancement could repair the world engine. You do not build stars. Your vessel runs on localized chemical combustion and a primitive warp bubble generator that is slowly poisoning your own crew. We're mechanics, David said simply. We fix things. You break things to fix them, the archivist corrected. It is a paradox. Our engineers would have let the city burn rather than violate the structural integrity of the math. We believed perfection was the only path to salvation. The alien knelt, bringing its face closer to David's level. You are not gods. You are not custodians. But you stepped into the fire when the gods did not answer. The archivist reached out a long, slender hand, hovering it just inches from David's shoulder. It didn't touch him, a gesture of respect. What is the name of your species? Human. David said, humans. The alien tested the word. Creatures of dust and brute force. I will log this into the permanent archive. The day the math failed and the primitive scream saved us. Thomas snorted. Don't make it sound too poetic, pal. We just plugged in an extension cord. What about the rest of the sphere? Sarah asked, stepping up beside David. She pointed up toward the massive shattered rings orbiting the star. You saved this city, but your world engine is still falling apart. We can't hotwire a whole Dyson Sphere. You have given us the one variable we lacked. The archivist replied, standing to its full imposing height. Time. The shield will hold the atmosphere and repel the rot long enough for us to adapt. We will learn from your barbarism. We will strip the safeties. We will build crude bridges. We will survive. David nodded. Good, because we're out of tow cable. The repairs to the Orizaba took 48 agonizing hours, measured not by the rotation of a planet, but by the steady draining exhaustion in the crew's bones. The hangar trench had cooled, but the air still tasted of ozone and vaporized copper. The Orizaba sat on the pristine, mirror-polished deck like a rusted tin discarded in a cathedral. Her belly was scorched black, the titanium armor plating warped by the sheer thermal backwash of the hot-wired plasma line. One of the landing skids had buckled, leaving the ship listing slightly to port. It was an entirely surreal experience. The aliens, a civilization possessing the mathematical comprehension to cage a white dwarf star, had absolutely no concept of basic percussive maintenance. Thomas was currently wedged beneath the primary thruster manifold. He hadn't slept in 2 days. He was covered in a thick paste of engine grease and sweat, illuminated only by the harsh blue-white sputtering of his arc welder. He was attempting to fuse a slab of salvage durasteel over a ruptured coolant line. A dozen alien technicians stood in a wide semicircle around the ship, watching him. They didn't speak. They just stared, their 4 glowing eyes wide with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. To them, Thomas wasn't a mechanic. He was a butcher operating on a patient with a rusted saw. They're still doing it, Thomas grunted over the local comms channel. He slammed his heavy wrench against a stubbornly misaligned bolt. The sharp clang echoed through the cavernous hangar, making several of the towering aliens flinch. They're just standing there, staring. It's creeping me out, Dave. David stood at the top of the ship's lowered ramp, leaning heavily against the bulkhead. His joints ached. His uniform was stiff with dried sweat. He looked down at the assembly of alien engineers. They've never seen anyone fix a machine by hitting it, David said quietly. Let them watch. Maybe they'll learn something. I asked one of them for a hydro spanner. Thomas complained the sound of his arc welder flaring up again. It looked at me like I asked it to invent a new color. They don't have tools, Dave. Everything they build just grows. It's all harmonic resonance and subatomic weaving. To prove his point, the archivist stepped forward from the silent crowd. The towering biomechanical entity approached the Orizaba, holding a small, unadorned canister of brushed silver. It stopped a few feet from where Thomas's boots stuck out from under the ship. Your primitive heat fusion is damaging the localized crystalline structure of your vessel. The archivist's synthesized voice echoed through the hangar. You are weakening the metal to seal the breach. It is mathematically unsound. Thomas slid out from under the chassis on a creeper board. He pushed his welding goggles up into his greasy hair and glared at the 8FT tall alien. It's called a weld, pal, and it's going to hold the air in when we punch through subspace. Unless you've got a better idea. The archivist knelt, its massive frame folding with a fluid, terrifying grace. It extended a long, multi-jointed hand and offered the silver canister. This is molecular bonding resin. The archivist explained. It was designed to repair microfractures in the world engine's primary containment spheres. Apply it to the breach. It will command the atomic structure of your durasteel to weave itself whole. Thomas eyed the canister suspiciously. He took it, wiping his grease-stained hands on his overalls first. He twisted the cap off. Inside, a thick, luminescent silver fluid swirled, sluggishly glowing with a soft internal light. All right, let's see the magic trick. Thomas rolled back under the ship. He dabbed a tiny drop of the glowing resin onto the jagged, blackened crack of the ruptured coolant line. Instantly, the metal hissed. A sound like grinding glass filled the air. Before Thomas's eyes, the scorched, warped edges of the durasteel began to crawl. The metal flowed together like liquid, sealing the breach on a subatomic level. Within 3 seconds, the crack was gone. In its place was a flawless mirrored surface that looked stronger than the day the ship was built in the orbital yards of Mars. Thomas slid back out, holding the canister up. He looked at the archivist, then up at David on the ramp. I'm keeping this, Thomas declared, his voice deadly serious. I'm going to fix the coffee maker in the break room, and my bunk hinge and my boots. David allowed a faint, tired smile to touch his face. Just don't glue yourself to the deck, Chief. Get the primary thrusters online. I want to be ready to jump within the hour. Thomas grunted an affirmative and slid back to work, whistling a low off-key tune. David turned and walked up the ramp, entering the dim, cool interior of the Orizaba. The ship smelled faintly of stale recycled air and burnt ozone, but it felt incredibly safe. It felt like home. He found Sarah on the bridge. She was slumped in her chair, a half-empty ration pack discarded on the floor beside her. Her eyes were bloodshot, fixated on the tactical displays. The nicotine patch on her neck was peeled back at the edges. How's the local grid holding? David asked, stepping up behind her and looking at the monitors. It's not a grid anymore, Captain. It's a sledgehammer, Sarah replied, her voice raspy. She tapped a key, bringing up the visual feed of the chasm 2 miles away. The jury-rigged power line still burned. The jury-rigged power lines still burned. The massive high-tensile steel tow cable was a line of blinding stellar heat pumping the raw, unfiltered fury of the captive star directly into the shield pylon. The blue dome had been replaced by a thick, violently bright barrier of roaring white plasma. It crackled and spat, entirely devoid of the elegant mathematical grace the aliens had engineered. It was ugly. It was loud. It was deeply, inherently dangerous. But the rot was gone, burned to ash, and the vacuum of space was held at bay. "It's holding at 400% capacity," Sarah said softly. "They have 14 billion people down there, Captain, and they're all watching that ugly wire burn. We saved them. We gave them time," David corrected gently. "They have to save themselves now. Have you finished scrubbing our navigation logs?" Sarah stiffened slightly. She looked up at David, her hands hovering over the keyboard. "I did. The local network keeps pinging our comms array. The archivist is requesting our origin coordinates. They want to establish a permanent communication tether. They want to send a formal broadcast of gratitude to Earth Command." David looked out the primary viewport, staring at the immaculate, seamless architecture of the alien hangar. He thought about Earth Command. He thought about the corporate boardrooms in the solar system filled with men and women who viewed the galaxy not as a living ecosystem, but as a balance sheet. He thought about the heavily armed corporate dreadnoughts patrolling the inner colonies, enforcing taxation and suppressing worker strikes with ruthless efficiency. If humanity, the greedy, ambitious, desperate humanity that David knew, found out there was a broken Tier 1 civilization sitting 80 light-years away, it wouldn't be a diplomatic mission. It would be a gold rush. They would swarm this dying mega-structure like vultures. They would strip the pristine metal, steal the molecular resin, and try to weaponize the quantum fluid. They would provoke a war with a species that, even broken and dying, could swat the entire human fleet out of the sky with a thought. Humanity wasn't ready to meet gods, especially wounded ones. "Captain," Sarah prompted softly, "what coordinates do I give them?" David's jaw tightened. "Give them the coordinates for the Perseus Arm Relay Station. The old one in Sector 4. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "The automated one, Captain. That's a secure corporate drop box. It's entirely unmanned. It just bounces signal echoes into deep space." "I know." Sarah stared at him for a long moment. A slow, knowing, cynical smirk spread across her exhausted face. "Protecting the gods from the suits, Dave? Protecting us from ourselves," David corrected, turning his gaze back to the viewport. "We did our job. We get paid by the hour, not by the miracle. Log it, Sarah, and lock down the nav computer." "Logged and locked," she said, her fingers flying across the console to execute the command. 20 minutes later, the Areciba's internal comms crackled to life. "Drive core is stable," Thomas reported from the engine room. "I bypassed the blown relays with some of the crystal conductors they gave us and slathered the whole housing in that magic blue. The Alcubierre drive is reading green. It's going to be a rough kick, but she fly." "Understood, Chief," David said. He strapped himself into the command chair, pulling the heavy harness tight across his chest. "Take us up, Sarah." The Areciba lifted off the deck. The artificial gravity stabilizers groaned, protesting the sudden movement. Through the viewport, David watched the aliens. There was no grand ceremony. There were no cheers, no waving flags. The towering biomechanical figures simply stood in the shadow of their newly ignited shield, watching the battered, scorched human hauler angle its nose toward the dark void. The archivist stood at the very front of the group. As the Orisaba cleared the hangar trench, the alien raised one long hand, pressing it flat against its own chest in a silent gesture of profound, permanent respect. "Coils are hot," Thomas called out. "Jumping in, 3, 2, 1. David braced himself. The universe ripped open. The Orisaba plunged headfirst into the violent, swirling violet tunnel of the subspace corridor. The transition was brutal. The bulkhead screamed as the inertial dampeners fought to keep the crew from being liquefied. Loose tools clattered against the metal decking, and the harsh red glow of emergency lighting strobed across the bridge. But the ship held. Bound by alien resin and human stubbornness, the heavy salvage rig tore through the fabric of space-time, leaving the realm of gods behind. When reality finally snapped back, decanting them into normal space, the silence was deafening. The Orisaba drifted in the dead calm of the outer Perseus arm. Outside the viewport, familiar constellations of distant cold stars greeted them. The deep space static returned a low, empty hum that ground against the hull. It was the sound of isolation. It was the sound of the mundane. David unbuckled his harness, letting out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 3 days. He had never been so happy to hear the sound of absolutely nothing. "Sarah," David said quietly into the heavy silence. "Yes, Captain," she replied, leaning back in her chair and rubbing her neck. "If we pick up any more ghost frequencies on the quantum band, I'll log them as background radiation," Sarah replied without missing a beat, not even turning around. "Good." David reached down and picked up his cracked ceramic mug from the deck. It was completely empty, smelling faintly of old coffee and fresh ozone. "Tom put on a fresh pot and test that new glue on the machine." "Copy that, Dave." Thomas's voice came through sounding lighter than it had in days. "Making it now." The Orisaba sailed forward into the dark, a rusted, battered garbage truck heading back to the middle of nowhere. They had touched the edge of eternity. They had heard the perfect math break, and they had fixed it with brute force and a tow cable. But the universe was a big broken machine, and humanity was just trying to keep their own small engines running. If this story resonated with you, ensure you give the video a like and leave a comment down below about what you would do if you were on the Orisaba. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to never miss another deep dive into the galaxy's darkest corners. Share this with a fellow sci-fi fan, and until next time, keep your comms open and your eyes on the stars. Your eyes on the stars.